The Return by Walter de la Mare. After visiting a graveyard, a man finds his appearance has mysteriously changed. Returning home only to be received with horror and suspicion by his family, he must reckon with the social consequences of his bizarre transformation while searching for an explanation and solution. Look not for roses in Atlas, his garden, or wholesome flowers in a venomous plantation. And since there is scarce any one bad, but some others are the worse for him, tempt not contagion by proximity, and hazard not thyself in the shadow of corruption. Sir Thomas Browne. Chapter 1. The churchyard in which Arthur Lawford found himself wandering that mild and golden September afternoon was old, green, and refreshingly still. The silence in which it lay seemed as keen and mellow as the light, the pale, almost heatless sunlight that filled the air. Here and there robins sang across the stones, elvishly shrill in the quiet of harvest. The only other living creature there seemed to Lawford to be his own rather fair, not insubstantial, rather languid self, who, at the noise of the birds, had raised his head and glanced, as if between content and incredulity, across his still and solitary surroundings. An increasing inclination for such lonely ramblings, together with the feeling that his continued ill health had grown a little irksome to his wife, and that now that he was really better, she would be relieved at his absence, had induced him to wander on from home without much consideration where the quiet lanes were leading him. And in spite of a peculiar melancholy that had welled up into his mind during these last few days, he had certainly smiled with a faint sense of the irony of things on lifting his eyes in an unusually depressed moodiness, to find himself looking down on the shadows and peace of Widderstone. With that anxious irresolution which illness so often brings in its train, he had hesitated for a few minutes before actually entering the graveyard. But once safely within, he had begun to feel extremely loath to think of returning back again, and this not the less at remembering with a real foreboding that it was now drawing towards evening, that another day was nearly done. He trailed his umbrella behind him over the grass-grown paths, staying here and there to read some time-worn inscriptions, stooping a little broodingly over to the dark green graves. Not for the first time during the long, laborious convalescence that had followed apparently so slight an indisposition, a fleeting sense almost as if of an unintelligible remorse had overtaken him, a vague thought that behind all these past years, hidden as it were from his daily life, lay something not quite reckoned with. How often as a boy had he been wrapped into a galvanic activity out of the deep reveries he used to fall into, those fits of a kind of fish-like daydream. How often, and even far beyond boyhood, had he found himself bent on some distant thought or fleeting vision that the sudden clash of self-possession had made to seem quite illusory, and yet had left so strangely haunting. And now the old habit had stirred out of its long sleep, and through the gate that influenza in departing had left ajar, had returned upon him. But I suppose we are all pretty much the same if we only knew it, he had consoled himself. We keep our crazy side to ourselves, that's all. We just go on for years and years, doing and saying whatever happens to come up. And really keen about it, too. He had glanced up with a kind of challenge in his face at the squat little belfry, and then, without the slightest reason or warning, down you go, and it all begins to wear thin, and you get wondering what on earth it all means. Memory slipped back for an instant to the life that in so unusual a fashion seemed to have floated a little aloof. Fortunately, he had not discussed these inward symptoms with his wife. How surprised Sheila would be to see him loafing in this old, crooked churchyard. How she would lift her dark eyebrows with that handsome, indifferent tolerance. He smiled, but a little confusedly, yet the thought gave even a spice of adventure to the evening's ramble. He loitered on, scarcely thinking at all now, stooping here and there. These faint, listless ideas made no more stir than the sunlight gilding the fading leaves, the crisp turf underfoot. With a slight effort, he stooped even once again. Stranger, a moment pause and stay. In this dim chamber, hidden away, lies one who once found life as dear as now he finds his slumber here. Pray then the judgment but increase his deep, everlasting peace. But then, do you know you lie at peace? Lawford audibly questioned, gazing at the doggerel. And yet, as his eyes wandered over the blunt green stone and the rambling crimson-berried briar that had almost encircled it with its thorns, the echo of that whisper rather jarred. He was, he supposed, rather a dull creature. At least, people seemed to think so, and he seldom felt at ease even with his own small facetiousness. Besides, just that kind of question was getting very common. Now that cleverness was the fashion, most people were clever, even perfect fools, and cleverness, after all, was often only a bore, all head and no body. He turned languidly to the small, cross-shaped stone on the other side. Here lies the body of Anne Hard, who died in childbed. Also of James, her infant son. He muttered the words over with a kind of mournful bitterness. That's just it. That's just how it goes. He yawned softly. The pathway had come to an end. Beyond him lay ranker grass, one and another obscurer mounds, and old scarred oak seed shadowed by a few everlastingly green cypresses and coral-fruited yew trees. And above and beyond all hung a pale blue arch of sky with a few voyaging clouds like silvered wool, and the calm, wide curves of a stubble field and pasture land. He stood with vacant eyes, not in the least aware how queer a figure he made with his gloves and his umbrella and his hat among the stained and tottering gravestones. Then, just to linger out his hour, and half sunken in reverie, he walked slowly over to the few solitary graves beneath the cypresses. One only was commemorated with a tombstone, a rather unusual oval-headed stone carved at each corner into what might be the heads of angels, or of pagan dryads, blindly facing each other with worn-out, sightless faces. A low, curved granite canopy arched over the grave, with a crevice so wide between its stones that Lawford actually bent down and slid in his gloved fingers between them. He straightened himself with a sigh, and followed with extreme difficulty the well-nigh illegible inscription, "Here lie ye, bones of one, Nicholas Sabbather, a stranger to this parish, who fell by his own hand on ye eve of St. Michael and all angels. NDCC XXXIX." Of the date, he was a little uncertain. The hand had lost its N and D, and all the angels rain had erased. He was not quite sure even of this stranger. There was a great rich S, and the twisted tail of a G, and whether or not Lawford smilingly thought, he is no stranger now. But how rare and how memorable a name. French, evidently, probably Huguenot, and the Huguenots, he remembered vaguely, were a rather remarkable crowd. He had, he thought, even played at Huguenots once. What was the man's name? Coligny, yes, of course, Coligny. And I suppose, Lawford continued, muttering to himself, I suppose this poor beggar was put here, out of the way. They might, you know, he added confidentially, raising the ferrule of his umbrella. They might have stuck a stake through you and buried you at the crossroads. And again, a feeling of ennui, a faint disgust at his poor little witticism clouded over his mind. It was a pity thoughts always ran the easiest way, like water in old ditches. Here lie ye bones of one Nicholas Sabathier, he began murmuring again. Merely bones, mind you. Brains and heart are quite in another story, and it's pretty certain the fellow had some kind of brains. Besides, poor devil, he killed himself. That seems to hint at brains. Oh, for goodness sake, he cried out loud, so loud that the sound of his voice alarmed even a robin that had perched on a twig almost within touch, with glittering eye intent above its dim red breast on this other and even rarer stranger. I wonder if it is XXXIX. It might be LXXIX. Lawford cast a cautious glance over his round grey shoulder, then laboriously knelt down beside the stone and peeped into the gaping cranny. There he encountered merely the tiny, pale green, faintly conspicuous eyes of a large spider confronting his own. It was, for the moment, an alarming and yet a faintly fascinating experience. The little, almost colourless fires remained so changeless. But still, even when at last they had actually vanished into the recesses of that quiet habitation, Lawford did not rise from his knees. An utterly unreasonable feeling of dismay, a sudden weakness and weariness had come over him. What is the good of it all? He asked himself, inconsequently, this monotonous, restless, stupid life to which he was soon to be returning, and for good. He began to realize how ludicrous a spectacle he must be, kneeling here amid the weeds and grass beneath the solemn cypresses. Well, you can't have everything, seemed loosely to express his disquiet. He stared vacantly at the green and fretted gravestone, dimly aware that his heart was beating with an unusual effort. He felt ill and weak. He leant his hand on the stone and lifted himself onto the low wooden seat nearby. He drew off his glove and thrust his bare hand under his waistcoat, with his mouth a little ajar and his eyes fixed on the dark square turret, its bell sharply defined against the evening sky. Dead. A bitter inward voice seemed to break into speech. Dead. The viewless air seemed to be flocking with hidden listeners. The very clearness and the crystal silence were their ambush. He alone seemed to be the target of cold and hostile scrutiny. There was not a breath to breathe in this crisp, pale sunshine. It was all too rare, too thin. The shadows lay like wings everlastingly folded. The robin, that had been his only living witness, lifted its throat and broke, as if from the uttermost outskirts of reality, into its shrill, passionless song. ʟɪᴏᴏᴏ moved heavy eyes from one object to another. Bird, sun-gilded stone, those two small earthborn faces, his hands, a stirring in the grass as of some creature laboring to climb up. It was useless to sit here any longer. He must go back now. Fancies were all very well for a change, but must be only occasional guests in a world devoted to reality. He leaned his hand on the dark grey wood and closed his eyes. The lids presently unsealed a little, momentarily revealing astonished, aggrieved pupils, and softly, slowly, they again descended. The flaming rose that had swiftly surged from the west into the zenith, dyeing all the churchyard grass a wild and vivid green, and the stooping stones above it a pure, faint purple, waned softly back like a falling fountain into its basin. In a few minutes, only a faint orange burned in the west, dimly illuminating with its band of light the huddled figure on his low wood seat, his right hand still pressed against a faintly beating heart. Dusk gathered, the first white stars appeared out of the shadowy fields, and nightjar purred. But there was only the silence of the falling dew among the graves. Down here, under the ink-black cypresses, the blades of the grass were stooping with cold drops, and darkness lay like the hem of an enormous cloak, whose jewels above the breast of its wearer might be in the unfathomable clearness the glittering constellations. In his small cage of darkness, ʟɪᴏᴏ shuddered and raised a furtive head. He stood up and peered eagerly and strangely from side to side. He stayed quite still, listening as raptly as some wandering night beast to the indiscriminate stir and echoings of the darkness. He cocked his head above his shoulder and listened again, then turned upon the soundless grass towards the hill. He felt not the faintest astonishment or strangeness in his solitude here, only a little chilled and physically uneasy, and yet in this vast darkness a faint spiritual exaltation seemed to hover. He hastened up the narrow path, walking with knees a little bent, like an old labourer who has lived a life of stooping, and came out into the dry and dusty lane. One moment his instinct hesitated as to which turn to take. Only a moment, he was soon walking swiftly, almost trotting downhill with this vivid exaltation and this huge, dark night in his heart, and Sheila merely a little angry Titanesque cloud on a scarcely perceptible horizon. He had no notion of the time. The golden hands of his watch were indiscernible in the gloom. But presently, as he passed by, he pressed his face close to the cold glass of a little shop window and pierced that out by an old Swiss cuckoo clock. He would, if he hurried, just to be home before dinner. He broke into a slow, steady trot, gaining speed as he ran on, vaguely elated to find how well his breath was serving him. An odd smile darkened his face at remembrance of the thoughts he had been thinking. There could be little amiss with the heart of a man who could shamble along like this, taking even pleasure, an increasing pleasure, in this long, wolf-like stride. He turned round occasionally to look into the face of some fellow wayfarer whom he had overtaken, for he felt not only this unusual animation, this peculiar zest, but that, like a boy on some secret errand, he had slightly disguised his very presence, was going masked, as it were. Even his clothes seemed to have connived at this queer illusion. No tailor had for these 10 years allowed him so much latitude. He cautiously at last opened his garden gate, and with soundless agility mounted the 6 stone steps, his latchkey ready in his gloveless hand, and softly let himself into the house. Sheila was out, it seemed, for the maid had forgotten to light the lamp. Without pausing to take off his greatcoat, he hung up his hat, ran nimbly upstairs, and knocked with a light knuckle on his bedroom door. It was closed, but no answer came. He opened it, shut it, locked it, and sat down on the bedside for a moment. In the darkness, so that he could scarcely hear any other sound, as he sat erect and still like some night animal wary of danger, attentively alert. Then he rose from the bed, threw off his coat, which was clammy with dew, and lit a candle on the dressing table. Its narrow flame lengthened, drooped, brightened, gleamed clearly. He glanced around him, unusually contented, at the ruddiness of the low fire, the brass bedstead, the warm red curtains, the soft silveriness here and there. It seemed as if a heavy and dull dream had withdrawn out of his mind. He would go again some day and sit on the little hard seat beside the crooked tombstone of that friendless old Huguenot. He opened a drawer, took out his razors, and, faintly whistling, returned to the table and lit a second candle. And still, with the strange, heightened sense of life stirring in his mind, he drew his hand gently over his chin and looked unto the glass. For an instant, he stood, head to foot, icily still, without the least feeling, or thought, or stir, staring into the looking-glass. Then an inconceivable drumming beat on his ear. A warm surge, like the onset of a wave, broke in him, flooding neck, face, forehead, even his hands with colour. He caught himself up and wheeled deliberately and completely round, his eyes darting to and fro, suddenly to fix themselves in a prolonged stare, while he took a deep breath, caught back his self-possession, and paused. Then he turned and once more confronted the changed, strange face in the glass. Without a sound, he drew up a chair and sat down, just as he was, frigid and appalled, at the foot of the bed. To sit like this, with a kind of incredibly swift torrent of consciousness bearing echoes and images like straws and bubbles on its surface, could not be called thinking. Some stealthy hand had thrust open the sluice of memory, and words, voices, face of mockery streamed through without connection, tendency, or sense. His hands hung between his knees, a deep and settled frown darkened the features stooping out of the direct rays of the light, and his eyes wandered like busy and inquisitive but stupid animals over the floor. If, in that flood of unintelligible thoughts, anything clearly recurred at all, it was the memory of Sheila. He saw her face lit, transfigured, distorted, stricken, appealing, horrified. His lids narrowed, a vague terror and horror mastered him. He hid his eyes in his hands and cried without sound, without tears, without hope, like a desolate child. He ceased crying and sat without stirring. And it seemed, after an age of vacancy and meaninglessness, he heard a door shut downstairs, a distant voice, and then the rustle of someone slowly ascending the stairs. Someone turned the handle in vain. Tapped. "Is that you, Arthur?" For an instant, Lawford paused. Then, like a child listening for an echo, answered, "Yes, Sheila." And a sigh broke from him. His voice, except for a little huskiness, was singularly unchanged. "May I come in?" Lawford stood softly up and glanced once more into the glass. His lips were set tight, and a slight frown settled between the long, narrow, intensely dark eyes. "Just one moment, Sheila," he answered slowly. "Just one moment." "How long will you be?" He stood erect and raised his voice, gazing the while impassively into the glass. "It's no use," he began, as if repeating a lesson. "It's no use your asking me, Sheila. Please, give me a moment. I am not quite myself, dear," he added quite gravely. The faintest hint of vexation was in the answer. "What is the matter? Can't I help? It's so very absurd." "What is absurd?" he asked dully. "I, standing like this outside my own bedroom door. Are you ill? I will send for Dr. Simon." "Please, Sheila, do nothing of the kind. I am not ill. I merely want a little time to think in." There was again a brief pause, and then a slight rattling at the handle. "Arthur, I insist on knowing at once what's wrong. This does not sound a bit like yourself. It is not even quite like your own voice." "It is myself," he replied stubbornly, staring fixedly into the glass. "You must give me a few moments, Sheila. Something has happened. My face. Come back in an hour." "Don't be absurd. It's simply wicked to talk like that. How do I know what you are doing? As if I can leave you for an hour in uncertainty. Your face? If you don't open at once, I shall believe there's something seriously wrong. I shall send Ada for assistance. If you do that, Sheila, it will be disastrous. I cannot answer for the Go quietly downstairs. Say I am unwell. Don't wait dinner for me. Come back in an hour. Oh, half an hour." The answer broke out angrily. "You must be mad, beside yourself, to ask such a thing. I shall wait in the next room until you call." "Wait where you please," Lawford replied, "but tell them downstairs." "Then, if I tell them to wait until 8:30, you will come down? You say you are not ill. The dinner will be ruined. It's absurd." Lawford made no answer. He listened a while, then he deliberately sat down once more to try to think. Like a squirrel in a cage, his mind seemed to be aimlessly, unceasingly astir. What is it really? What is it really? Really? He sat there, and it seemed to him his body was transparent as glass. It seemed he had no body at all, only the memory of an hallucinatory reflection in the glass, and this inward voice crying, arguing, questioning, threatening out of the silence. What is it really? 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 And at last, cold, wearied out, he rose once more and leaned between the two long candle flames and stared on into the glass. He gave that long dark face that had been foisted on him tricks to do, lift an eyebrow, frown. There was scarcely any perceptible pause between the wish and its performance. He found, to his discomfiture, that the fates answered instantaneously with the slightest emotion, even to his fainter secondary thoughts, as if these unfamiliar features were not entirely within control. He could not, in fact, without the glass before him, tell precisely what that face was expressing. He was still, it seemed, keenly sane. That he would discover for certain when Sheila returned. Terror, rage, horror had fallen back. If only he felt ill or was in pain, he would have rejoiced at it. He was simply caught in some unheard-of snare. Caught how? When? Where? By whom? Chapter 2. But the coolness and deliberation of his scrutiny had to a certain extent calmed Lawford's mind and given him confidence. Hitherto he had met the little difficulties of life, only to vanquish them with ease and applause. Now he was standing face to face with the unknown. He burst out laughing into a low, long, helpless laughter. Then he arose and began to walk softly, swiftly, to and fro across the room, from wall to wall 7 paces, and at the 4th, that awful, unseen, brightly lit profile passed as swiftly over the tranquil surface of the looking-glass. The power of concentration was gone again. He simply paced on mechanically, listening to a babble of questions, a conflicting medley of answers. But above all the confusion and turmoil of his brain, as a boatswain's whistle rises above a storm, so sounded that same, infinitesimal voice, incessantly repeating another question now. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And in the midst of this confusion, out of the infinite, as it were, came another sharp tap at the door, and all within sank into utter stillness again. It's nearly 8:30, Arthur. I can't wait any longer. Lawford cast a last fleeting look into the glass, turned, and confronted the closed door. Very well, Sheila. You shall not wait any longer. He crossed over to the door, and suddenly a swift, crafty idea flashed into his mind. He tapped on the panel. Sheila, he said softly, I want you first, before you come in, to get me something out of my old writing desk in the smoking room. Here is the key. He pushed a tiny key from off the ring he carried beneath the door. In the 3rd little drawer from the top on the left side is a letter. Please, don't say anything now. It is the letter you wrote me, you will remember, after I'd asked you to marry me. You scribbled in the corner, under your signature, the initials YSOA. Do you remember? They meant, you silly old Arthur. Do you remember? Will you please get that letter at once? Arthur, answered the voice from without, empty of all expression. What does all this mean? This mystery, this hopeless nonsense about a silly letter. What has happened? Is this a miserable form of persecution? Are you mad? I refuse to get the letter. Lawford stooped, black and angular, against the door. I am not mad. Oh, I am in the deadliest earnest, Sheila. You must get the letter, if only for your own peace of mind. He heard his wife hesitate as she turned. He heard a sob, and once more he waited. I have brought the letter, came the low, toneless voice again. Have you opened it? There was a rustle of paper. Are the letters there underlined 3 times? YSOA? The letters are there, and the date of the month is underneath, April 3rd. No one else in the whole world, living or dead, could know of this but ourselves, Sheila. Will you please open the door? No one. I suppose not. No one. Then come in." He unlocked the door and opened it. A dark, rather handsome woman with sleek hair and a silk dress of a dark, rich color entered. Lawford closed the door, but his face was in shadow. He had still a moment's respite. "I need not ask you to be patient," he began quickly. "If I could possibly have spared you, if there had been anybody in the world to go to, I am in horrible, horrible trouble, Sheila. It is inconceivable. I said I was sane, so I am, but the fact is I went out for a walk. It was rather stupid, perhaps, so soon, and I think I was taken ill or something. My heart. A kind of fit, a nervous fit. Possibly I am a little unstrung, and it's mainly fancy, but I can't help thinking it has a little distorted, changed my face. Everything, Sheila, except of course myself. Would you mind looking?" He walked slowly, and with face averted towards the dressing table. "Simply a nervous... to make such a fuss, to scare," began his wife, following him. Without a word, he took up the 2 old china candlesticks and held them, one in each lank-fingered hand, before his face, and turned. Lawford could see his wife, every tint and curve and line as distinctly as she could see him. Her cheeks never had much color. Now her whole face visibly darkened from a pallor to a dusky, leaden grey as she gazed. It was not an illusion, then, not a miserable hallucination. The unbelievable, the inconceivable had happened. He replaced the candles with trembling fingers and sat down. "Well," he said, "what is it really? What is it really, Sheila? What on earth are we to do?" "Is the door locked?" she whispered. He nodded. With eyes fixed stirlessly on his face, Sheila unsteadily seated herself, a little out of the candlelight, in the shadow. Lawford rose and put the key of the door on his wife's little rosewood prayer desk at her elbow, and deliberately sat down again. "You said a fit. Where?" "I suppose is it very different? Hopeless? You will understand my being. Oh, Sheila, what am I to do?" His wife sat perfectly still, watching him with unflinching attention. "You gave me to understand. A nervous fit. Where?" Lawford took a deep breath and quietly faced her again. "In the old churchyard, Widderstone. I was looking at the gravestones." "A fit in the old churchyard, Widderstone. You were looking at the gravestones?" Lawford shut his mouth. "I suppose so, a fit," he said presently. "My heart went a little queer, and I sat down and fell into a kind of doze, a stupor, I suppose. I don't remember anything more. And then I woke, like this." "How do you know?" "How do I know what?" "Like that." He turned slowly towards the looking-glass. "Why, here I am." She gazed at him steadily, and a hard, incredulous, almost cunning glint came to her wide blue eyes. She took up the key carelessly, glanced at it, glanced at him. "It has made me... the first shock, you know. It has made me a little faint." She walked slowly, deliberately to the door and unlocked it. "I'll get a little sal volatile." She softly drew out the key and, without once removing her eyes from his face, opened the door and pushed the key noiselessly in on the other side. Please stay there. I won't be a moment. Lawford's face smiled, a rather desperate, yet for all that a patient, resolute smile. "Oh yes, of course," he said, almost to himself. "I had not foreseen, at least. You must do precisely what you please, Sheila. You are going to lock me in. You will, however, before taking any final step, please think over what it will entail. I did not think you would, after such proof in this awful trouble. I did not think you would simply disbelieve me, Sheila. Who else is there to help me? You have the letter in your hand. Isn't that sufficient proof? It was overwhelming proof to me, and even I doubted too, doubted myself. But never mind. Why I should have dreamed you would believe me or taken this awful thing differently, I don't know. It's rather awful to have to go on alone, but there, think it over. I shall not stir until I hear the voices. And then, honestly, Sheila, I couldn't quite face that. I'd sooner give up altogether. Any proof you can think of I will... Oh God, I cannot bear it." He covered his face with his hands, but in a moment looked up, unmoved once more. "Why? For that matter," he added slowly, and, as it were, with infinite pains, a faint, thin smile again stealing into his face. "I think," he turned wearily to the glass, "I think it's almost an improvement." Something deep in those dark, clear pupils out of that lean, adventurous face gleamed back at him, the distant flash of an heliograph, as it were, height to height, flashing. "Courage!" He shuddered and shut his eyes. "But I would really rather," he added in a quiet, childlike way, "I would really rather, Sheila, you left me alone now." His wife stood irresolute. "I understand you to explain," she said, "that you went out of this house, just your usual self this afternoon for a walk, that for some reason you went to Widderstone to read the tombstones, that you had a heart attack, or, as you said at first, a fit, that you fell into a stupor and came home like this. Am I likely to believe all that? Am I likely to believe such a story as that? Whoever you are, whoever you may be, is it likely? I am not in the least afraid. I thought at first it was some silly practical joke. I thought that at first." She paused, but no answer came. "Well, I suppose in a civilized country there is a remedy even for a joke as wicked as that." Lawford listened patiently. "She is pretending. She is trying me. She is feeling her way," he kept repeating to himself. "She knows I am I, but hasn't the courage. Let her talk." "I shall leave the door open," Sheila continued. "I am not, as you no doubt very naturally assumed, I am not going to do anything either senseless or heedless. I am merely going to ask your brother Cecil to come in, if he is at home, and if not, no doubt our old friend Mr. Montgomery would help us." Her scrutiny was still and concentrated, like that of a cat above a mouse's hole. Lawford sat crouched together in the candlelight. "By all means, Sheila," he said slowly, choosing his words. "If you think poor old Cecil, who next January will have been 3 years in his grave, will be any use in our difficulty, who Mr. Montgomery is," his voice dropped in utter weariness, "you did it very well, my dear," he added softly. Sheila gently closed the door and sat down on the bed. He heard her softly crying. He heard the bed shaken with her sobs. But a slow glance towards the steady candle flames restrained him. He let her cry on, alone. When she had become a little more composed, he stood up. "You have had no dinner," he managed to blurt out at last. "You will be faint. It's useless to talk, even to think any more tonight. Leave me to myself for a while. Don't look at me any more. Perhaps I can sleep. Perhaps if I sleep it will come right again. When the servants are gone up, I will come down. Just let me have some medical book or some other, and some more candles. Don't think, Sheila. Don't even think." Sheila paid him no attention for a little while. "You tell me not to think," she began in a low, almost listless voice. "Why, I wonder I am in my right mind. And eat. How can you have the heartlessness to suggest it? You don't seem in the least to realize what you say. You seem to have lost all consciousness. I quite agree. It is useless for me to burden you with my company while you are in your present condition of mind. But you will at least promise that you won't take any further steps in this awful business." She could not try as she would bring herself again to look at him. She rose softly, paused a moment with sidelong eyes, then turned deliberately towards the door. What have I done to deserve all this?" From behind her, that voice, so extraordinary-like, and yet in some vague fashion more arresting, more resonant than her husband's, broke incredibly out once more. "You will please leave the key, Sheila. I am ill, but I am not yet in the padded room, and please understand, I take no further steps in this awful business until I hear a strange voice in the house." Sheila paused, but the quiet voice rang in her ear desperately, yet convincingly. She took the key out of the lock, placed it on the bed, and with a sigh that was not quite without a hint of relief in its misery, she furtively extinguished the gaslight on the landing and rustled downstairs. She speedily returned. "I have brought the book," she said hastily. "I could only find the one volume. I have said you have taken a fresh chill. No one will disturb you." Lawford took the book without a word, and once more, with eyes stonily averted, his wife left him to his own company and that of the face in the glass. When completely deserted, Lawford with fumbling fingers opened Quain's Dictionary of Medicine. He had never had much curiosity and had always hated what he disbelieved, but nonetheless he had heard occasionally of absurd and questionable experiments. He remembered even to have glanced over reports of cases in the newspapers concerning disappearances, loss of memory, dual personality. Cranks. Oh yes, he thought now, with a sense of cold, humiliating relief, there had been such cases as his before. They were no doubt curable. They must be comparatively common in America, that land of jangled nerves. Possibly bromide, rest, a battery. But Quain, it seemed, shared his prejudices, at least in this edition, or had hidden away all such apocryphal matter beneath technical terms where no sensible man could find it. "Besides," he muttered angrily, "what's the good of your one volume?" He flung it down and strode to bed and rang the bell. Then suddenly, recollecting himself, he paused and listened. There came a tap on the door. "Is that you, Sheila?" he called, doubtfully. "No, sir, it's me." came the answer. "Oh, don't trouble. I only wanted to speak to your mistress. It's all right." "Mrs. Lawford has gone out, sir," replied the voice. "Gone out?" "Yes, sir. She told me not to mention it, but I suppose as you asked—" "Oh, that's all right, never mind. I didn't ring." He stood with face uplifted, thinking. "Can I do anything, sir?" came the faint, nervous question after a long pause. "One moment, Ada," he called in a loud voice. He took out his pocketbook, sat down and scribbled a little note. He hardly noticed how changed his handwriting was, the clear, round letters crabbed at a regular. "Are you there, Ada?" he called. "I'm slipping a note beneath the door. Just draw back the mat, that's it. Take it at once, please, to Mr. Critchett's, and be sure to wait for an answer. Then come back direct to me up here. I don't think, Ada, your mistress believes much in Critchett, but I have fully explained what I want. He has made me up many prescriptions. Explain that to his assistant if he is not there. Go at once, and you will be back before she is. I should be so very obliged. Tell him, Mr. Arthur Lawford." The minutes slowly drifted by. He sat quite still in the clear, untroubled light, waiting in the silence of the empty house. And, for the first time, he was confronted with the cold, incredible horror of his ordeal. Who would believe that behind this strange and awful, yet how simple mask lay himself? What test, what heaped-up evidence of identity would break it down? It was all a loathsome ignominy. It was utterly absurd. It was... Suddenly, with a kind of ape-like cunning, he deliberately raised a long, lean forefinger and pointed it at the shadowy crystal of the looking-glass. Perhaps he was dead, was really and indeed changed in body, was fated really and indeed to change in soul into that. "It's that beastly voice again," Lawford cried out loud, looking vacantly at his upstretched finger, and then, hand and arm, not too willingly as it were, obeyed, relaxed and fell to his side. "You must keep a tight hold, old man," he muttered to himself. Once you lose yourself, the least symptom of that, the least symptom, and it's all up." And the fools, the heartless, preposterous fools, had brought him 1 volume. When on earth was Ada coming back? She was lagging on purpose. She was in the conspiracy too. It should be a lesson to Sheila. If only daylight would come. What are you going to do? To do? He rose once more and paced his silent cage, to and fro, thinking no more, just using his eyes, compelling them to wander from picture to picture, bedpost to bedpost, now counting aloud his footsteps, now humming, only to keep himself from thinking. At last, he took out a drawer and actually began arranging its medley of contents. Ties, letters, studs, concert and theatre programs, all higgledy-piggledy. And in the midst of this childish stratagem, he heard a faint sound, as of heavy water trickling from a height. He turned. A thief was in one of the candles. It was guttering out. He would be left in darkness. He turned hastily, without a moment's heed, to call for light, flung the door open, and full in the flare of a lamp illuminating her pale forehead and astonished face beneath her black straw hat, stood face to face with Ada. With one swift, dexterous movement, he drew the door to after him, looking straight into her almost colorless, steady eyes. "Ah," he said instantly, in a high, faint voice. "The powder. thank you, yes. Mr. Lawford's powder, thank you. He must be kept absolutely quiet, absolutely. Mrs. Lawford is following. Please tell her that I am here when she returns. Mr. Critchett was in then? Thank you. Extreme silence, please. Again, that knotted, melodramatic finger raised itself on high, and within that lean, cadaverous body the soul of its lodger quailed at this spectral boldness. But it was triumphant. The maid at once left him and went downstairs. He heard faint voices and muffled consultation, and in a moment Sheila's silks rustled once more on the staircase. Lawford put down the lamp and watched her deliberately close the door. What does this mean? She began swiftly. I understand that Ada tells me a stranger is here giving orders, directions. Who is he? Where is he? You bound yourself on your solemn promise not to stir till I returned. How can we get decently through this horrible business if you are so wretchedly indiscreet? You sent Ada to the chemist's. What for? What for, I say? Lawford watched his wife with an almost extraneous interest. She was certainly extremely interesting from that point of view, that very novel point of view. It's quite useless, he said, to get in the least nervous or hysterical. I don't care for the darkness just now, that was all. Tell the girl I am the strange doctor, Dr. Simon's new partner. You are clever at conventionalities, Sheila. Invent. I said our patient must be kept quiet. I really think he must. That is all, as so far as Ada is concerned. What on earth else are we to say? He broke out. That for the present to everybody is our only possible story. It will give us what we must have. Time. And next, where is the second volume of Quain? I want that. And next, why have you broken faith with me? Mrs. Lawford sat down. This sudden and baffling outburst had stupefied her. I can't make head or tail of what you say. And as for having broken faith, as you call it, would any sane woman face what you have brought on us, a situation like this, without seeking advice and help? Mr. Bethany will be perfectly discreet, if he thinks discretion desirable. He is the only available friend we have close enough to ask at once. And things of this kind are, I suppose, if anybody's concern, his. It's certain to leak out. Everybody will hear of it. Don't flatter yourself you are going to hush it up a thing like this for long. You can't keep living skeletons in a cupboard. You think only of yourself, only of your misfortune. But who's to know, pray, that you really are my husband, if you are? The sooner I get the view on my side, the better for us both. Who, in the whole of the parish, I ask you, and you must have the sense left to see that, who believes that a respectable man, a gentleman, a churchman, would deliberately go out to seek an afternoon's amusement in a poky little country churchyard? Why, apart from everything else, that was absolutely mad to start with. Can you really wonder at the result? Probably because she still steadfastly refused to look at him, her memory kept losing its hold on the appalling fact facing them. She realized fully only that she was in a great, unwarrantable and insurmountable difficulty, but until she actually lifted her eyes for a moment, she had not fully realized what that difficulty was. She got up with a sudden and horrible nausea. "One moment," she said. "I will see if the servants have gone to bed." That long, saturnine face, behind which Lawford lay in a dull and desperate ambush, smiled. Something partaking of its clay, some reflex ghost of its rather remarkable features, was even a little amused at Sheila. She returned in a moment and stood in profile in the doorway. "Will you come down?" she remarked distantly. "One moment, Sheila," Lawford began miserably, "before we take this irrevocable step. A step I implore you to postpone a while, for what comes, I suppose, may go. What precisely have you told the vicar? I must in fairness know that." "In fairness," she began ironically, and suddenly broke off. Her husband had turned the flame of the lamp low down in the vacant room behind them. The corridor was lit obscurely by the chandelier far down in the hall below. A faint, inexplicable dread fell softly and coldly on her heart. "Have you no trust in me?" she murmured a little bitterly. "I have simply told him the truth." They softly descended the stairs, she first, the dark figure following close behind her. Chapter 3. Mr. Bethany sat awaiting them in the dining room, a large, heavily furnished room with a great benign looking-glass on the mantelpiece, a marble clock, and with rich old damask curtains. Fleecy silver hair was all that was visible of their visitor when they entered, but Mr. Bethany rose out of his chair when he heard them, and with a little jerk turned sharply around. Thus it was that the gold-spectacled vicar and Lawford first confronted each other, the one brightly illuminated, the other framed in the gloom of the doorway. Mr. Bethany's first scrutiny was timid and courteous, but beneath it he tried to be keen, and himself hastened round the table almost at a trot, to obtain as delicately as possible a closer view. But Lawford, having shut the door behind him, had gone straight to the fire and seated himself, leaning his face in his hands. Mr. Bethany smiled faintly, waved his hand almost as if in a blessing, but certainly in peace, and tapped Mrs. Lawford into the chair upon the other side, but he himself remained standing. "Mrs. Lawford has, I declare, been telling family secrets," he began, and paused, peering. "But there, you will forgive an old friend's intrusion, this little confidence about a change, my dear fellow, about a ramble and a change." He sat down, put up his kind little puckered face, and peered again at Lawford, and then very hastily at his wife. But all her attention was centered on the bowed figure opposite her. Lawford responded to this cautious advance without raising his head. "You do not wish me to repeat all that my wife tells me she has told you?" "Dear me, no," said Mr. Bethany cheerfully. "I wish nothing, old friend. You must not burden yourself with me. If I may be of any help, here I am. Oh, no, he paused, with blinking eyes, but still shrewd and alert. Why doesn't the man raise his head, he thought. A mere domestic dispute. "I thought," he went on ruminatingly, "I thought on Tuesday, yes, on Tuesday, that you weren't looking quite the thing. Indeed, I remarked on it. But now I understand from Mrs. Lawford that the milady has taken a graver turn, eh, Lawford? An heretical turn? I hear you must have been wandering from the true fold." Mr. Bethany leaned forward with what might be described as a very large smile and a very small compass. "And that, of course, entailed instant retribution." He broke off solemnly. "I know Widderstone churchyard well, a most verdant and beautiful spot. The late rector of Mr. Strickland was a very old friend of mine, and his wife, dear good Alicia, used to set out her babies in the morning to sleep and to play there, 20, dear me, perhaps 25 years ago. But I did not know, my dear Lawford, that you—" And suddenly, without an instant's warning, something seemed to shout at him. Look, he is looking at you." He stopped, faltered, and a slight warmth came into his face. And you were taken ill there? His voice had fallen flat and faint. I fell asleep, or something of that sort, came the stubborn reply. Yes, said Mr. Bethany brightly. So your wife was saying. Fell asleep. So have I too, scores of times. He beamed with beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. And then, I'm not persisting. Then I woke, refreshed, I think, as it seemed. I felt much better and came home. Ah, yes, said his visitor. And after that there was a long, brightly lit, intense pause, at the end of which Lawford raised his face and again looked firmly at his friend. Mr. Bethany was now a shrunken old man. He sat perfectly still, his head craned a little forward, and his veined hands clutching his bent, spare knees. There wasn't the least sign of devilry or outfacingness or insolence in that lean, shadowy, steady head, and yet he himself was compelled to sidle his glance away, so much the face shook him. He closed his eyes too, as a cat does after exchanging too direct a scrutiny with human eyes. He put out towards and withdrew a groping hand from Mrs. Lawford. "Is it," came a voice from somewhere, "is it a great change, sir? I thought perhaps I may have exaggerated. Candlelight, you know." Mr. Bethany remained still and silent, striving to entertain one thought at a time. His lips moved as if he were talking to himself, and again it was Lawford's faltering voice that broke the silence. "You see," he said, "I have never no fit or anything of that kind before. I remember on Tuesday, yes, quite well. I did feel seedy, very, and we talked, didn't we? Harvest festival, Mrs. Wine's flowers, the new offertory bags, and all that. For God's sake, Vicar, it is not as bad as they make out." Mr. Bethany woke with a start. He leaned forward and stretched out a long black wrinkled sleeve, just managing to reach far enough to tap Lawford's knee. Don't worry, he said soothingly. We believe. It was nonetheless a sheer active face. He took off his spectacles and took out his handkerchief. "What we must do, my dear?" He half turned to Mrs. Lawford. "What we must do is to consult. Yes, consult together. And later, we must have advice, medical advice, unless, as I very much suspect, it is merely a little quite temporary physical aberration. Science, I am told, is making great strides, experimenting, groping after things which no sane man has ever dreamed of before, without being burned alive for it. What's in a name? Nerves, especially, Lawford." Mrs. Lawford sat perfectly still, absorbedly listening, turning her face first this way, then that to each speaker in turn. "That is what I thought," she said, and cast one fleeting glance across at the fireplace, but the little old gentleman turned sharply, with half-blind eyes and lips tight shut. "I think," he said, with a kind of austere humour, do you know, I see no but." He paused, as if to catch the echo, and added, "It's our only course." He continued to polish round and round his glasses. Mrs. Lawford rather magnificently rose. "Perhaps if I were to leave you together a while, I shall not be far off. It is," she explained as if into a huge vacuum, "it is a terrible visitation." She moved gravely round to the table and very softly and firmly closed the door after her. Lawford took a deep breath. "Of course," he said, "you realize my wife does not believe me. She thinks," he explained naively as if to himself, She thinks I am an imposter. Goodness knows what she does think. I can't think much myself for long. The vicar rubbed busily on. I have found, ʟɪᴏᴏᴏ, he said smoothly, that in all real difficulties, the only feasible plan is to face the main issue. The others right themselves. Now, to take a plunge into your generosity, you have let me in far enough to make it impossible for me to get out. May I hear then exactly the whole story? All that I know now, so far as I could gather from your wife, poor soul, is of course inconceivable. That you went out one man and came home another. You will understand, my dear man, I am speaking, as it were, by rote. God has mercifully ordered that the human brain works slowly. First the blow, hours afterwards the bruise. Dare me, that man Hume, on miracles, positively amazing. So that too, please, you'll be quite clear about. Credo, not queer, impossible, but because you, ʟɪᴏᴏ, have told me. Now then, if it won't be too worrisome to you, the whole story. He sat, lean and erect in his big chair, a hand resting loosely on each knee, and one spectacles, and the other a dangling pocket handkerchief. And in the dark, sallow, aquiline, formidable figure with its oddly changing voice retold the whole story from the beginning. You were aware, then, of nothing different, I understand, and you actually looked into the glass? Only vaguely. I mean that after waking I felt much better, more alert. And my thoughts. Ah yes, your thoughts. I hardly know. Clear, as if I had had a real long rest. It was just like being a boy again. Influenza dispirits one so. Mr. Bethany gazed without stirring. And yet, you know, he said, I can hardly believe, conceive how. You have been taking no drugs, no quackery, ʟɪᴏᴏ? I never doze myself, said ʟɪᴏᴏ with sombre pride. God bless me, that's ʟɪᴏᴏ to the echo, thought his visitor. And before, he went on gently, I really cannot conceive, you see, how a mere fit could. Before you sat down, you were quite alone? He stuck out his head. There was nobody with you? With me? Oh no, came the soft answer. What had you been thinking of? In these days of faith cures and hypnotism and telepathy and subliminalities, why, the simple old world grows very confusing, but rarely, very rarely novel. You were thinking, you say, do you remember, perhaps just the drift? Well, began ʟɪᴏᴏ ruminatingly, there was something curious even then, perhaps. I remember, for instance, I knelt down to read an old tombstone. There was a little seat, no back, and an epitaph. The sun was just setting, some French name, and there was a long, jagged crack in the stone, like the black line, you know, one sees after lightning. It's as clear as that even now in memory. Oh yes, I remember. And then, I suppose, came the sleep. Stupid, sluggish, and then, well, here I am. You are absolutely certain, then, persisted Mr. Bethany, almost querulously. There was no living creature near you. Bless me, ʟɪᴏᴏ, I see no unkindness in believing what the Bible itself relates. There are powers supernatural, Saul, and so on. We are all convinced of that. No one? I remember distinctly, replied ʟɪᴏᴏ in a calm, stubborn voice. I looked up all around me while I was kneeling there, and there wasn't a soul to be seen. Because, you see, it even then occurred to me that it would have looked rather queer, me wandering about like that, Facing me there were some cypress trees, and beyond a low sunken fence, and then just open country. Up above there were the gravestones toppling down the hill where I had just strolled down, and sunshine. He suddenly threw up his hand. Oh, marvellous! Streaming in gold, flaming, like God's own antechamber. There was a very pregnant pause. Mr. Bethany shrunk back a little into his chair. His lips moved. He folded his spectacles. Yes, yes. And then very quietly he stole one mole-like look into his sideman's face. What is Dr. Simon's number? He said. Lawford was gazing gloomily into the fire. Oh, Annandale, he replied absently. I don't know the number. Do you believe in him? Your wife mentioned him. Is he clever? Oh, he's new, said Lawford. Old James was our doctor. He killed my father. He laughed out shamefacedly. A sound, lovable man, said Mr. Bethany. One of the kindest men I ever knew, and a very old friend of mine. And suddenly, the dark face turned with a shudder from the fire and spoke in a low, trembling voice. Only one thing, my sanity. My sanity. If once I forget, who will believe me? He thrust his long, lean fingers beneath his coat. And mad, he added. I would sooner die. Mr. Bethany deliberately adjusted his spectacles. May I experiment? He said boldly. There came a tap on the door. Bless me, said the vicar, taking out his watch. It is 11:45. Yes, yes, Mrs. Lawford, he trotted round through the door. We are beginning to see light. A ray. But I can see in the dark, whispered Lawford, as if at a cue, turning with an inscrutable smile to the fire. The vicar came again, wrapped up in a little tight grey greatcoat and a white silk muffler. He looked up, unflinching, into Lawford's face, and tears stood in his eyes. Patience, my dear fellow, he repeated gravely, squeezing his hand. And rest. Complete rest is imperative. Just till the first thing tomorrow, and till then. He turned to Mrs. Lawford, where she stood looking in at the open doorway. Oh yes, complete quiet and caution. Mrs. Lawford let him out. He shook his head once or twice, holding her fingers. Oh yes, he whispered. It is your husband, not the smallest doubt. I tried, for myself, but something has happened. Don't fret him now. Have patience. Oh yes, it is incredible, the change. But there, the very first thing tomorrow. She closed the door gently after him and, stepping softly back to the dining room, peered in. Her husband's back was turned, but he could see her in the looking-glass, stooping a little, with set face watching him in the silvery stillness. Well, he said, is the old... He doggedly met the fixed eyes facing him there. Is our old friend gone? Yes, said Sheila. He's gone. Lawford sighed and turned round. It's useless talking now, Sheila. No more questions. I cannot tell you how tired I am. And my head. What is wrong with your head? Inquired his wife discreetly. The haggard face turned gravely and patiently. Only one of my old headaches, he smiled. My old bilious headaches, the hereditary Lawford variety. But his voice fell low again. We must get to bed. With a rather pretty and childish movement, Sheila gently drew her hands across her silk skirts. Yes, dear, she said. I have made up a bed for you in the large spare room. It is thoroughly aired. She came softly in, hastened over to a closed work table that stood under the curtains, and opened it. Lawford watched her, utterly expressionless, utterly motionless. He opened his mouth and shut it again, still watching his wife as she stooped with ridiculously too busy fingers, searching through her coloured silks. Again he opened his mouth. "Yes," he said, and stalked slowly towards the door. But there he paused. "God knows," he said strangely and meekly. "I am sorry. Sorry for all this. You will forgive me, Sheila?" She looked up swiftly. "It's very tiresome. I can't find anywhere," she murmured. "I can't find anywhere the little red box key." Lawford's cheek turned more sallow than ever. "You are only pretending to look for it," he said, "to try me. We both know perfectly well the lock is broken. Ada broke it." Sheila let fall the lid, and yet for a while her eyes roved over it as if in violent search for something. And then she turned. "I'm so very glad the vicar was at home," she said brightly. "And mind you rest, Arthur. There's nothing so bad, but it might be worse. Oh, I can't bear it." She sat down in the chair and huddled her face between her hands, sobbing on and on without a tear. Lawford listened and stared solemnly. "Whatever it may be, Sheila, I will be loyal," he said. Her sobs hushed, and again cold horror crept over her. Nobody in the whole world could have said that "I will be loyal" quite like that. Nobody but Arthur. She stood up, patting her hair. "I don't think my brain would bear much more. It's useless to talk. If you will go up, I will put out the lamp." Chapter 4. One solitary and tall candle burned on the great dressing table. Faint, solitary pictures broke the blankness of each wall. The carpet was rich, the bed impressive, and the basins on the washstand as uninviting as the bed. Lawford sat down on the edge of it in complete isolation. He sat without stirring, listening to his watch ticking in his pocket. The china clock on the chimney-piece pointed cheerfully to the hour of dawn. It was exactly, he computed carefully, 5 hours and 7 minutes fast. Not the slightest sound broke the stillness until he heard, very, very softly, and gradually, the key of his door turn in the oiled wards, and realized that he was a prisoner. Women were strange creatures. How often he had heard that said, he thought lamely. He felt no anger, no surprise or resentment at the trick. It was only to be expected. He could sit on till morning, easily till morning. He was never noticed before how empty a well-furnished room could seem. It was his own room, too, his best visitor's room. His father-in-law had slept here with his whiskers on that pillow. His wife's most formidable aunt had been all night here alone with these pictures. She certainly was. "But what are you doing here?" cried a voice suddenly out of his reverie. He started up and stretched himself, and taking out the neat little packet that the maid had brought from the chemist's, he drew up a chair and sat down once more in front of the glass. He sighed vacantly, rose, and lifted down from the wall above the fireplace a tinted photograph of himself that Sheila had had enlarged about 12 years ago. It was a brighter, younger, hairier, but unmistakably the same dull, indolent Lawford who had ventured into Widderstone churchyard that afternoon. The cheek was a little plumper, the eyes not quite so full-lidded, the hair a little more precisely parted, the upper lip graced with a small blonde mustache. He tilted the portrait into the candlelight and compared it with this reflection in the glass of what had come out of Widderstone, feature with feature, with perfect composure and extreme care. Then he laid down the massive frame on the table and gazed quietly at the tiny packet. It was to be a day of queer experiences. He had never before realized with how many miracles mere everyday life is besieged. Here in this small punctualist packet lay a sesame, a power of transformation beside which the transformation of that rather flaccid face of the noonday into this tense, sinister face of midnight was but as a moving from house to house. A change just as irrevocable and complete, and yet so very normal. Which should it be, that, or his face lifted itself once more to the ice-like gloom of the looking-glass? That, or this? It simply gazed back with a kind of quizzical pity on its lean features under the scrutiny of eyes so deep, so meaningful, so desolate, and yet so indomitably courageous. In the brain behind them, a slow and stolid argument was in progress, the one baffling reply on the one side to every appeal on the other being still simply, what dreams may come? Those eyes surely knew something of dreams, else why this violent and stubborn endeavor to keep awake? Lawford did indeed once actually frame the question. But who the devil are you? And it seemed really the eyes perceptibly widened or brightened. The mere vexation of his unparalleled position, Sheila's pathetic incredulity, his old vicar's laborious kindness, the tiresome network of experience into which he would be dragged struggling on the morrow, and on the morrow after that, and after that. The thought of all these things faded for the moment from his mind, lost, if not their significance, at least their instancy. He simply sat face to face with the sheer difficulty of living on at all. He even concluded in a kind of lethargy that if nothing had occurred, no change, he might still be sitting here, Arthur Rennet Lawford, in his best visitor's room, deciding between inscrutable life and just death. He supposed he was tired out. His thoughts hadn't even the energy to complete themselves. None cared but himself and this silence. But what does it all mean? The insistent voice he was getting to know so well began tediously inquiring again, and every time he raised his eyes, or rather, as in many cases it seemed, his eyes raised themselves, they saw this haunting face there. A face he no longer bitterly rebelled at, nor dimmed with scrutiny, but a face that was becoming a kind of hold on life, even a kind of refuge, an ally. It was a face that might have come out of a rather flashy book, or such as revered on the stage. A rotten, bad face, he whispered, as added in his own familiar slang after such a rough encounter. A fearless, pat, daring, fascinating face with even, what, a spice of genius in it. Whose the devil's face was it? What on earth was the matter? Brazen it out, a jubilant thought cried suddenly. Follow it up. Play the game. Give me just one opening. Think what I've risked. And all these voices, thought Lawford in deadly lassitude, meant only one thing. Insanity. A blazing, impotent indignation seized him. He leaned near, peering, as it were, out of a red, dusky mist. He snatched up the china candlestick and poised it above the sardonic reflection as if to throw. Then slowly, with infinite pains, he drew back from the glass and replaced the candlestick on the table, stuffed his paper packet into his pocket, took off his boots, and threw himself onto the bed. In a little while, in the faint, still light, he opened drowsily wondering eyes. "Poor old thing," his voice murmured. "Poor old Sheila."